Right now, somewhere in West Africa, a child who has never tasted chocolate is bent over a cacao pod with a machete almost as long as his arm. He is one of roughly 1.5 million children working the farms of the Ivory Coast and Ghana, the two countries that grow more than half the cocoa on Earth. He will split the pod, scoop the wet seeds, and pass them up a chain that ends in a foil-wrapped bar in a checkout aisle 8,000 miles away. He will likely never see that bar. He will almost certainly never afford it. And the sweetness that the entire world associates with comfort, with love, with reward, was built, from the very beginning, on someone else's suffering. That is the part I want you to hold on to. Because we treat chocolate as the softest thing in the world. We give it to children. We give it on the day we celebrate love. We reach for it when we are sad. It is the most emotionally gentle product in the modern kitchen. And it has a body count. But the story of chocolate does not begin in a factory, or a Valentine, or a European court. It begins thousands of years earlier, in the steaming lowland forests of what is now southern Mexico and Guatemala, with a tree so strange that the people who found it believed it had fallen out of the sky. The tree is Theobroma cacao. That name was given to it much later by a European botanist, and it means, quite literally, food of the gods. He did not choose those words as marketing. He chose them because, when he studied how the people of Mesoamerica treated this plant, food of the gods was simply the accurate translation of what they already believed. You have to understand what cacao looks like in the wild, because it explains everything that follows. It is an awkward, almost secretive tree. The pods do not hang from the outer branches where you'd expect fruit. They grow directly out of the trunk, and the oldest limbs swollen and ridged, in colors of gold and deep red and violet. Crack one open, and you do not find chocolate. You find a cluster of seeds wrapped in a white, wet pulp. That pulp is sweet and citrusy. The seeds themselves, the beans, the part we actually use, are, in their raw state, brutally, mouth-puckeringly bitter. Nothing about a raw cacao bean says dessert. Nothing about it says sweet. If you bit into one expecting a candy bar, you would spit it out. And that is the first great secret of chocolate. Everything you love about it is an invention. Everything you love about it was added later. In its original form, the food of the gods was a bitter, spiced, foaming drink that could sober you up, and some believed, connect you to the dead. Let me undo what you think you know. For most of its history, for the overwhelming majority of the time humans have used cacao, chocolate was not sweet, it was not solid, and it was not a treat. It was a drink. It was often savory or spicy, cut with chili and cornmeal and annatto that stained the lips blood red. And it was not casual. Among the Maya and later the Aztecs, cacao was sacred, medicinal, and controlled. It appeared at royal feasts, at weddings, in religious rites, and it was poured out in the presence of the gods. The Maya had a word that translates roughly to chocolate water. And archaeologists have found residue of it inside ceremonial vessels buried with the dead, placed there so the deceased would not go thirsty on the journey into the underworld. Think about that for a second. The same substance you keep in a drawer for a bad day was, for 1,000 years, considered food fit to accompany a soul into the afterlife. And here's the reversal that almost nobody knows. Cacao was not only sacred, it was money. Literal, spendable money. By the time of the Aztec Empire, cacao beans functioned as currency across a huge swath of Mesoamerica. Not a metaphor for wealth. Actual coinage you could carry in a pouch and spend in a market. We have the exchange rates because the Spanish wrote them down in astonishment. A single cacao bean might buy you a ripe tamale. Around 30 beans could buy a small rabbit. 100 beans could buy a turkey. And, according to one colonial account, a man could be bought. An enslaved person's price set in beans. Hold those two facts next to each other, because this is the collision at the heart of the whole story. A handful of these dry, wrinkled seeds, the same seeds we now grind into a candy bar, could purchase a human life, or be poured into a cup and offered to a god. Sweet nothing to us, currency and sacrament to them. And where there is money, there is fraud. The Aztecs had counterfeiters. Because cacao beans were currency, clever criminals learned to carefully hollow out the beans, remove the valuable interior, and pack the empty shells with mud or wax, so they still had the right weight and heft. Fake money, 500 years before anyone forged a dollar bill, and the forgery was a chocolate bean stuffed with dirt. The Aztec state took this seriously. Debasing the currency, then as now, was a crime that struck at the foundations of the economy. And the foundation, in this case, grew on trees. So how did a bitter tree seed become spendable money and holy drink at the same time? That is where we meet the ancient genius. The peoples of Mesoamerica, the Olmec first, then the Maya, then the Aztec, did something with cacao that borders on the miraculous when you consider they had no chemistry, no written science of the kind we'd recognize, no laboratories. They took a seed that is inevitably bitter and through a long chain of steps transformed it into something precious. First, they let the seeds and pulp ferment, piled up and covered for days. Fermentation is the hidden hero of chocolate. Without it, you have no chocolate flavor at all, just bitterness. Then they dried the beans. Then they roasted them. Then they ground them, by hand on stone, into a thick paste. Then they whipped that paste with water, pouring the liquid from one vessel to another held high above the head, again and again, to raise a thick, prized foam. That foam was the best part. The froth was the point. They did not have the word fermentation as we understand it. They did not have a molecular explanation for why roasting develops flavor. But they were running a sophisticated biochemical process with total precision, passed down and refined across roughly 3,000 years. They were doing the chemistry without the vocabulary for it. And they had done it so completely that when Europeans finally encountered chocolate, they could not improve on the basic method for over a century. They just copied it. They took the entire technology, fermenting, roasting, grinding, frothing, from the people they were in the process of destroying. Which brings us to the collision of two worlds, and to a moment of almost comic misunderstanding that would eventually reshape the diets of the entire planet. When the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, they did not immediately fall in love with chocolate. The opposite. They were disgusted by it. One of the earliest European descriptions from an Italian traveler called it a bitter drink, more fit for pigs than for men. The color unsettled them. The chili burned them. The idea of drinking something cold, foamy, and blood red, stained with annatto, struck them as barbaric, even to some as vaguely demonic, because they watched it used in native religious ceremony. This is the establishment rejection, and it has a wonderfully absurd second act, because it moved from taste straight into theology. Once chocolate did catch on in Europe, and it did, spectacularly, the Catholic Church found itself with a genuinely agonizing problem. During fasting periods, the faithful were forbidden from eating. But was chocolate a food or a drink? Because if it was merely a drink, like water or wine, then a devout Catholic could sip it all through Lent without breaking the fast. If it was a food, it was forbidden. This was not a trivial argument. It went on for well over a century. It reached bishops. It reached, by some accounts, the Pope himself. Theologians wrote lengthy treatises on the metaphysical status of a cup of hot chocolate. Wealthy churchgoers, unwilling to give up their new habit, had a powerful motive to insist it was just a drink. There's a famous, and probably embellished, story from the town of Chiapas, in which local Spanish ladies so refused to sit through Mass without their servants bringing them cups of chocolate that a bishop tried to ban the practice inside the church, and, the legend says, shortly afterward died suddenly, poisoned, some whispered, by a cup of the very drink he'd tried to forbid. Poisoned chocolate, as revenge for banning chocolate in church. Whether or not it's literally true, people told that story because it captured something real. Europeans had become so attached to this foreign drink so fast that they would sooner poison a bishop than skip it. That is beat 5, and it did not go flat. They really did spend 100 years arguing whether chocolate could break a holy fast. But arguments in churches don't move a product across an ocean and into every court in Europe. For that, you need obsessives. You need someone a little unhinged. Enter the eccentrics who carried chocolate up the social ladder. The habit spread first through the Spanish court, kept almost as a state secret for decades. Spain guarded chocolate the way a country might guard a weapon, and for the better part of a century, the rest of Europe barely knew it existed. It traveled on royal marriages. A Spanish princess is said to have brought her chocolate habit to the French court when she married into it, smuggling the taste across a border along with her retinue. It became the private addiction of aristocrats. In the Spanish court, there were noble women so devoted to it that physicians warned them they were drinking themselves sick. And then there's the man I find impossible not to root for. Not a king, but a wandering French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu. His obsession was not chocolate itself, but its source, the cacao and coffee that Europe now craved. The story most often told is about coffee, but it belongs to the same fever of the age, the same lunatic determination to carry a tropical plant across the sea and plant an empire's future in the soil of a colony. De Clieu, the legend says, nursed a single seedling across the Atlantic on a becalmed, water-starved ship, sharing his own meager water ration with the plant, guarding it from a jealous passenger who tried to tear it from his hands. Men were dying of thirst around him, and he was giving half his cup to a plant. That is the energy of this era. Europe had tasted these New World stimulants and lost its collective mind. Guarded gardens, smuggled seedlings, botanists risking their lives. Entire colonial economies conjured out of the desperate desire to grow closer to home, a plant that had been sacred on the other side of the world. And that desire is where the story turns dark. Because to grow cacao on the scale Europe now demanded, you needed two things in staggering quantities. You needed tropical land, and you needed people to work it who would not be paid. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. The transformation of chocolate from a rare court luxury into a mass-produced global commodity runs directly, unavoidably, through slavery. As the plantations spread across the Caribbean, across coastal South America, and later across the Portuguese-controlled islands off the coast of Africa, they ran on forced labor. On the island of São Tomé, off the coast of Central Africa, the Portuguese built a cacao economy so profitable that at one point that tiny island was among the largest cocoa producers on the planet. And it ran well into the 20th century, long after slavery had been officially abolished, on a system of contract labor that was slavery in everything but name. Workers were shipped from mainland Angola, told they were free laborers, and never allowed to leave. They died on those plantations at horrifying rates. When one worker died, another was shipped in to replace him. The paperwork said contract. The reality was a grave. I want to slow down here because this is the emotional core, and it deserves more than a statistic. Picture one man on São Tomé. He was born on the African mainland. He was marched to the coast, put on a boat, and carried to an island he had never heard of, to grow a crop he would never eat, for people whose language he did not speak. His contract was for a fixed number of years, but the contracts were quietly, endlessly renewed, and almost no one was ever sent home. When he died, of disease, of exhaustion, of despair, his death was recorded, if it was recorded at all, as the end of a labor agreement, not a murder, a closed account. And the chocolate made from the beans he harvested was sold in the elegant shops of London and Paris, wrapped in the language of comfort and indulgence, to people who would have been genuinely horrified to know what they were tasting. This is the part that should make you angry. The gentlest product in the world, the one we hand to children, spent centuries soaked in the labor of people who were worked to death in secret. And here is where we name the villain. Not a single man this time, but a company and the men who ran it, because their story is almost unbearably ironic. In the early 20th century, the great British chocolate firms, including the Quaker family businesses, whose entire public identity was built on Christian morality, social reform, and the humane treatment of workers, were buying much of their cacao from São Tomé. These were companies founded by men who genuinely believed themselves to be good. They built model villages for their English workers. They campaigned against cruelty, and they were buying beans grown by slaves. When a journalist named Henry Nevinson traveled to the region and documented what he saw, the shackles, the marched columns of laborers, the trail of bones along the paths where the exhausted had fallen and been left, he published it. The firms could no longer plead ignorance, and their response reveals the machinery of how comfortable people live with atrocity. They did not immediately stop buying. They commissioned investigations. They corresponded politely, at length, about the problem. One of the family's own representatives was sent to see for himself and confirmed the horror. And still the beans kept flowing for years, while the paperwork was arranged and the reputations were protected. The moral separation is the thing to hold on to here. The disease and the distance were not their fault. The choice to keep buying once they knew, that was policy. That was a decision made by men in comfortable offices who wrote about it in official business correspondence, not in private confession. The blight of slavery was old and vast and not invented by them. The decision to keep profiting from it after seeing it with their own eyes, that was theirs. Eventually, under public pressure, the great firms boycotted Sao Tome cacao and shifted their buying to the British colonies of West Africa, to the Gold Coast, modern Ghana, and to what would become the Ivory Coast. And that shift is the reason West Africa grows most of the world's chocolate today. It was not because the land there was uniquely blessed. It was because an empire needed a new, cleaner-looking place to source an addiction. The plantations moved, the pattern did not. And that pattern, the child at the beginning of the story, machete in hand, is its living descendant. Sit with that for a moment, because the numbers are staggering. The world eats more than 7.5 million tons of cocoa every year. The chocolate industry is worth well over $100 billion annually. And the two West African nations that grow more than half of it capture only a small fraction of that value. The wealth is made in the wrapping and the branding and the selling in countries that grow no cacao at all. The farmer who grows the bean often earns less than $1 a day. Many of the farmers themselves have never tasted finished chocolate. Let that land. The people who grow the raw material of the world's favorite indulgence, in many cases, have never once tasted the thing they make possible. Now let me change the temperature, because the story is not only darkness, and the modern facts are genuinely astonishing. Start with the transformation that made the modern bar possible, because everything you think of as chocolate is barely 200 years old. For over 3,000 years, chocolate was a drink. It became a solid, edible bar only in the 19th century, through a chain of industrial breakthroughs. A Dutch chemist named Van Houten invented a press that squeezed the fat, the cocoa butter, out of the bean, leaving a powder that could be easily dissolved. That same process, Dutching, treated the powder to make it milder and darker. Then someone realized that if you added that extracted cocoa butter back into ground cacao, along with sugar, you could create a smooth solid that melted in the mouth. The first true eating chocolate. Then a Swiss man named Daniel Peter, working with his neighbor, a maker of baby formula named Henri Nestlé, figured out how to fold milk into it without the whole thing spoiling. Milk chocolate was born from a partnership between a chocolatier and a man who made powdered milk for infants. And then came the detail I find quietly astonishing. The smoothness of a modern chocolate bar, that impossible velvet melt, was discovered partly by accident and perfected by a machine that grinds the chocolate continuously for hours, sometimes for days. It is called a conch because the first version was shaped like a shell. A Swiss maker named Rodolphe Lindt, a name you have seen in a checkout aisle, reportedly left his mixing machine running over a weekend by mistake and came back to find the harsh, gritty chocolate of the age transformed into something silken. The luxurious mouthfeel you associate with fine chocolate may owe its existence to a machine somebody forgot to turn off. Here are the facts to carry out of this with you. The average American eats around 12 pounds of chocolate a year. 12 pounds. The Swiss and the Germans eat nearly double that. Cocoa butter, the fat pressed out of the bean, melts at just below human body temperature, which is the actual scientific reason chocolate melts in your mouth and nowhere else quite the same way. It was engineered by evolution to stay solid in a tropical forest and to dissolve the instant it meets the warmth of a tongue. There is a war story, too. During the Second World War, the United States government commissioned a special chocolate ration bar for soldiers, and the specification was almost funny in its cruelty. The Army specifically ordered that it should taste only a little better than a boiled potato, so that soldiers would eat it for energy in an emergency, but not be tempted to devour their survival ration early. They deliberately made bad chocolate on purpose as a matter of military policy. Those bars, the D ration, were produced by the hundreds of millions. Chocolate has gone to war, and it has gone to space. it was aboard the earliest crewed missions because it delivers dense energy in a small, stable package. And here's a modern fraud worthy of the Aztec bean forgers. Because cocoa butter is expensive, the industry has fought for decades over how much cheaper vegetable fat can be substituted before a product legally stops being chocolate at all. Countries have gone to diplomatic war over the definition. There was a years-long fight within Europe over whether a bar containing other vegetable fats could even be sold under the name chocolate, a battle so heated that nations accused each other of debasing the very meaning of the word. 500 years apart, and we are still arguing about counterfeit chocolate. We are still hollowing out the bean and filling it with something cheaper. There is one more thing, and it belongs to the descendants of the people who started all of this. In the highlands of Mexico and Guatemala today, there are communities who still make chocolate the old way, fermented, roasted on a stone, ground by hand, whipped into a spiced, bitter, foaming drink at weddings and funerals and festivals, exactly as their ancestors did before any European had ever seen a cacao pod. Not as a museum exhibit, as a living thing. When they raise that foam, they are performing an unbroken ritual 3,000 years old, older than most of the world's religions, a technology and a sacrament that survived conquest, plague, and the theft of nearly everything else. That is their story. It belongs to them. The rest of the world took the bean and made it sweet and made it cheap and made it a valentine. They kept the original, and the original was never a treat. It was a prayer. So think about that child again, the one we started with, bent over a pod on the Ivory Coast with a machete almost as long as his arm, harvesting the raw material of the world's comfort, having never tasted the comfort himself. He is not an accident of the modern world. He is the direct inheritor of a pattern 500 years old, a food born sacred, turned into money, spread by obsession, and grown again and again and again by people who were never meant to enjoy it. A handful of bitter seeds bought a human life in an Aztec market. A handful of bitter seeds still costs a human childhood in a West African field. The currency became an addiction, and the addiction never stopped being paid for in people. That is the weight inside the wrapper. That is what melts just below body temperature on your tongue. You will never look at chocolate the same way again. Before you go, tell me in the comments which of these stopped you cold. The army that deliberately engineered a chocolate bar to taste barely better than a boiled potato? The Swiss maker who left the machine running all weekend and accidentally invented the melt you love? Or the fact that the farmers who grow most of the world's cocoa have never once tasted finished chocolate? Pick one, tell me why, and if this changed the way you see the thing in your kitchen drawer, subscribe, because every ordinary object you own is hiding a story exactly like this one.